Thank you all very much for joining us this morning. My name is Steve McMenamin. I'm from the Indian Harbor Group here in town. I'm your host for today's event, which is part of the ongoing series of the Greenwich Roundtable. Today I have the distinct pleasure of welcoming back one of our most distinctive underwriters, Flag Capital Management. Flag is one of our favorites because they keep us rooted in venture capital and private equity. We'd also like to thank Peter Sutton of the Bruce Museum for providing us with such an attractive venue today, and Leslie McDonald. Our topic this morning, the outlook on healthcare and life science strategies, is a continuation of a session we last examined in April of 2000. In that session, we heard Craig Venter announce that he was on the verge of mapping the Drosophilous genome and the growing importance of the science of proteonomics. He also said that commercial applications from genomics would not be ready for another 30 to 50 years. Perhaps today we'll get a progress report on this very promising investment sector. We also made a conscious decision to exclude healthcare hedge funds because of their mixed performance. Recently at the roundtable, we've heard so many pessimistic and hair-raising discussions. Today, perhaps we'll hear something a bit more optimistic. Today, our panelists are three of the brightest lights in their sector, all very different from each other. At this point, I'd like to introduce them. Paul Queally is a general partner at Welsh, Carson, Anderson & Stowe, where he focuses on healthcare investing. Welsh Carson is one of the leading buyout firms in the country, with over $11 billion invested since 1979. Welsh Carson is also a leading investor in healthcare and information industries. For Welsh Carson, Mr. Queally was a general partner at the Sprout Group. He is currently the chairman of Concentra Managed Care, SHPS, and Amerisafe. Paul is a board member of the United Surgical Partners, Ameripath, Medcath, and several private companies. He was previously a founding investor in, among others, Hawk Medical Corporation, Sunrise Assisted Living, Lab One OcuSystems, and Surgical Health Corporation. Sitting to Paul's left, Terry McGuire is the managing partner of the Boston-based Polaris Venture Partners, where he focuses on life science investing. Polaris is a firm he founded with Steve Arnold, John Flint in 1996. Before Polaris, Terry spent 7 years at Burr Egan, Deliage, investing in early-stage medical and information companies. Terry began his career in venture capital at Golder, Toma & Cressy in Chicago. Terry has co-founded Advanced Inhalation Research Company and the Microchips Company. Terry represents Polaris on the boards of CodeWrite, Glycophi, Microbia, Microchips, Remon, and Transform Pharmaceuticals. Terry currently serves on the boards of the Thayer School of Engineering, Dartmouth College, the Private Equity and Entrepreneurial Center at the Amos Tuck School, Dartmouth College, and Whitehead Institute of Biomedical Research, the Advisory Board for the Arthur Rock Center of Entrepreneurship at the Harvard Business School, and the Massachusetts Biotechnology Council. Mr. McGuire holds an MBA from Harvard Business School and an MS in Engineering from Dartmouth College. This is probably one of the most extensive and impressive bios I've ever read.
By the way, I'm not talking about mine.
Yes, sir. Robert Langer is a professor of chemical and biomedical engineering at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Dr. Langer has written over 780 articles, has over 500 issued or pending patents worldwide. His patents have been licensed or sub-licensed to over 100 companies, a number of which were launched on the basis of these patent licenses. He serves as a member of the United States Food and Drug Administration's Science Board, the FDA's highest advisory board, from 1995 to 2002. And as its chairman from 1999 to 2002. Rob has received over 120 major awards. In 2002, he received the Charles Stark Draper Prize, considered the engineering equivalent of the Nobel Prize. In 1998, he received the Lemelson MIT Prize, the world's largest prize for invention for being one of history's most prolific inventors in medicine. One might say that Rob Langer is a modern-day Thomas Edison. Forbes magazine named him as one of the 25 most important individuals in biotechnology in the world. He's served on 15 boards of directors and 30 scientific boards of such companies as Wyeth, Warner Lambert, Guilford Pharmaceuticals. He earned his Doctorate of Science from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in 1974. Sitting to my left, Peter Lawrence is the moderator of the Greenwich Roundtable today. He's a co-founder and managing partner of Flag Capital Management, the first private equity fund of funds dedicated solely to families. He is a member of the Board of Trustees of the Greenwich Roundtable. Under his watchful eye, Peter keeps reminding us that alternative investing is not the exclusive domain of hedge funds. We're very proud of Peter and his partner Diana Frazier, sitting to my right, and the firm they've built. Flag is the only member of the Roundtable to have a Harvard case study written about them. Peter is a delight to work with because his Rolodex is the only one that may be larger than mine. So at this point, let me turn it over to Peter for today's discussion.
Thank you very much, Steve. We're thrilled to have this panel with us today, and it's an interesting subject because healthcare would seem, commonsensically at least, to appear to be a very fertile area for investment. In no field do the demographics tilt so favorably in our direction. An aging population requires more healthcare services, more medications. In no field are scientific breakthroughs advancing our knowledge so rapidly with such potentially humanity-changing implications. In no field is this sense of entitlement to and demand so price inelastic for the services that are provided as they are in healthcare. So why is it so difficult to generate returns in the healthcare industry, be it healthcare services, healthcare devices or tools, or certainly in life sciences? Why have formerly balanced venture capital funds suspended or abandoned their healthcare practices? Why have so few buyout funds decided to develop a practice in the healthcare services area? It would seem so obvious. What is it that they know that we don't know, or better said, what is it that this panel knows that they don't know about how to invest in these fields? Today we do have three of the top investors and entrepreneurs in their respective sectors, as Steve mentioned. So perhaps they can answer some of these questions and many more of yours today. We have a bit of a different format. Paul's area of specialty is the healthcare services area. And so Paul's going to kick off and give you, I think, a great background as to how he goes about this business. And then Terry and Bob are going to give you a real sense for how venture capitalists and scientists and entrepreneurs coordinate their practices. So you may see a bit of an overlap in the way they present. But let's get started with Paul.
Well, thank you, Peter. You certainly didn't come here to hear me. I'm interested in hearing Dr. Langer.
Baloney.
That is quite an impressive background. It's too bad you couldn't take the SATs for me. A little background on Welsh Carson, and I do appreciate coming to the Greenwich Roundtable. It's quite an honor. We were founded in 1979, which makes us one of the oldest private equity firms in the business. We started with a $33 million fund, and we just raised our last equity fund 4 years ago, at $3.9 billion. And between that time, we actually lost market share, so it tells you what our industry has done. We also just had our first close on our fourth sub-debt fund, which we call Welsh Carson Capital Partners, and that's Capital Partners 4. We distinguish ourselves from our competitors in many different ways. We have $12 billion under management, which makes us one of the top 10 largest private equity firms in the business. We're the only large fund that focuses on a limited number of industries. We invest only in the healthcare and information and business services. We also occasionally will dabble in the communications sector, although candidly our performance there is less than stellar. We're also willing to participate in transactions of all sizes, from startups to largest buyout we've ever done was $7.5 billion. We bought the Quest Dex Yellow Pages. And our captive sub-debt fund allows us to speak for all parts of the capital structure. Our focus creates unique opportunities for our portfolio companies and their executives. Interestingly, we did a study, and it showed that over 50% of the deals that our portfolio companies are doing came directly from WCAS. So even though these companies were dominant in their segments of healthcare or information services, the deal flow comes from us. Additionally, we provide a terrific career path for executives. We tend to back the same teams over and over again. We have a father and son team called the name of the Hortensios. We've backed 3 times, made money with them each time. The last time we created a very successful company from scratch called Select Medical. A gentleman who runs one of our most promising companies is a 3rd-time CEO with us, and I fired him from his first job. But I did so in a form and fashion that he really wanted to come back and work with us. And then most importantly, unlike some of our competitors, we have a firm policy of never speaking to the press. So you don't hear our name, and that's a conscious decision on our part. We've been investing in the healthcare industry for the past 20 years. We've invested in healthcare providers, managed care organizations, distributors, information systems companies, and companies that provide services to healthcare providers. We actively look, but in the past 10 years we have not made an investment in the medical device company. We do not make investments in drug discovery companies or biotech companies. Since 1989, though, we've made 42 healthcare investments totaling over $3 billion. Our current portfolio consists of 8 companies with net revenues combined of $6.6 billion, EBITDA of nearly $750 million, and free cash flow is defined as EBITDA less CapEx and interest of $375 million. We are growers of companies. Our EBITDA this year over last year on those aggregate numbers should increase about 14%. Most importantly, 25 public healthcare companies can trace their roots in some form or fashion to WCAS sponsorship. In terms of a macro view of healthcare, we all know the statistics. We know about the aging population and the proliferation of technology, which is increasing lifespans. Interestingly, 1% of the population consumes a third of our healthcare costs. Another 9% consumes an additional third, and then 90% consumes the remaining third. What you might not know is the healthcare service industry is terribly undermanaged. 85% of the nation's hospitals are not-for-profit. The managers of these facilities, while they have wonderful motives, generally lack the sophistication to optimize efficiency. We have acute care hospital companies that we have owned and started and still have. And a good example would be on salaries and benefits as a percentage of net revenues. Our hospitals tend to run at 38%. The best not-for-profit will run 50 to 52%. And we're not doing that by restricting the number of labor hours or nursing hours per patient day. We're doing it by taking out the hierarchy. We're actually having our caregivers give care. I was also on the board of a not-for-profit hospital company, or a not-for-profit hospital, and I was really shocked by the governance and the managers who lack the courage to make the tough decisions. That's not to say that they can't, but many do not. And then finally, in terms of the undermanagement, a recently published study claimed that 50% of all healthcare IT projects fail. Could you imagine another industry where 50% of the IT projects fail? I can't. This undermanaged phenomenon creates an interesting umbrella pricing environment in both the state and federal markets. I was in Washington maybe 10 or 12 years ago, and the gentleman who ran PROPAC, which is the Senate's, it's actually the total Congress's kind of arm to advise them on health care, said we set the provider rates so the C provider makes nothing, but the A and B provider, those that are more efficient, can make whatever they want. When the government talks about reducing spending, what they're really saying is they want to reduce the rate of spending growth. They cannot reduce aggregate spending. And finally, not-for-profits are starving for capital. Fewer than 100 hospitals have investment-grade credits. Our firm view is that healthcare spending will continue to increase faster than GNP and undergo incremental restructurings over the next 5 years. We believe this will hold true in both the commercial and government payer markets. And the question is why? Well, on the expense side, employers have exhausted benefit buy-downs and pushing healthcare costs on employees. We think, in turn, employers will turn to disease management programs and increase the consumer's involvement in their healthcare decisions. Medicare will begin to move towards PPO plans. This was the quid pro quo of the prescription drug benefit, and it will have a dramatic impact on the hospital sector. Hospitals with poor commercial market shares are living day to day based on Medicare rack rates. Under a Medicare PPO environment, they will become price takers. Medicare is very interesting in that they pay each hospital the same, no matter if you have wonderful quality or below average quality, they're going to pay you the same thing. What other industry does that occur in? Healthcare investing is not for the faint of heart. It's a good business. If you do it right, you should earn returns in the mid-20s. If you do better than the mid-20s, then you've either truncated your holding period or taken unusual risks. The nice thing about healthcare service investing is you should rarely lose money. In the 42 deals we've done since 1989, we've only lost 8% of the invested dollars. And candidly, I can say that at least half of those losses were self-inflicted. They really shouldn't occur. What is unique also about the healthcare is the healthcare industry goes through 5 to 7 year cycles. And those cycles are driven by government funding, regulation changes, or altering payment methodologies. Said it another way, healthcare suffers from headline risk. And every 5 or 6 years, you'll find the government will throw up their arms and say, we cannot afford the current rate of spending. Or you'll find that fraud and abuse will percolate to the front of the newspaper. And as a result, all the healthcare stocks will suffer. That is the best time to buy. Healthcare multiples tend to trade in a band of 6 to 10 times EBITDA. And from a 50,000-foot perspective, our strategy is fairly simple. We want to buy when people are selling, and we want to sell when people are buying. In other words, we want to buy at 6 times and sell at 10 times, and today we are a net seller. Healthcare stocks are very, very pricey today. What we do is we look as a firm to market dislocations to buy our biggest companies. We use our domain knowledge to catch the baby when it's thrown out with the bathwater. Our last 3 public-to-private transactions have been non-auction properties, where upon the announcement of a negative company-specific event, we purchased stock in the company, approached the company, and said, we'd like to do a buyout. Please give us some time to do some due diligence, and then we'll give you the right to go shop our offer for a limited period of time. When the market is frothy as it is now, we use our domain knowledge to stay below the radar screen and do leverage buildups behind proven management teams. We have no problem starting companies behind a management team that wants to be inquisitive. When we do participate in auctions, which we do, we strive to finish our due diligence and have a fully financed, no due diligence outbid sooner than any other firm. Thankfully for us, competitively, most private equity investors do not understand the healthcare cycle. They are attracted to certain sectors when the multiples are highest, and too often confuse attractive multiples with long-term prospects. The nursing home industry is a perfect example of that. Back in 97, the 98 timeframe, nursing homes were trading at 10 times EBITDA. A number of our fellow firms bought big nursing home companies, and I believe each one went bankrupt. Why did it go bankrupt? Because the government changed the funding mechanism. What is our strategy? Specifically, our strategy is to invest in market leaders. We will pay up for quality. We believe that marginal properties cannot survive the healthcare cycle. We want to be in the best assets. We do not want to be in the 3rd and 4th provider in a city. We want to invest in experienced management teams. That, I'm sure everybody says that, but interestingly, the issues are the same in the healthcare industry from company to company. Once you've read the book a few times, you know what's going to happen. And we really believe that the operating model is what really matters in healthcare, and we try to break all companies down into a single level unit economic model. And our view is if that model has very strong ROI characteristics, as we aggregate that model, we'll have a very successful company. We only invest in controlled positions. We don't want to be minority investors. We also don't like to partner with other people. We don't want to share our domain knowledge. And finally, we want to limit our dependence on Medicare and Medicaid. You can never totally invest outside the Medicare or Medicaid arena, but you really don't want to be dependent on those 2 payers. Medicare can do some crazy things. They also will occasionally throw public pronouncements over the transom that they really don't intend to do, but it can cause it has a dramatic impact on your stock prices. And when you own those companies, it can be quite painful. Select Medical lost $1 billion in market value in one day because a staffer at Medicare decided that he'd float the idea of changing a Medicare payment methodology. Well, the industry reacted quite negatively to that. And Medicaid is a wonderful payer. Unfortunately, they don't pay enough, they don't pay on time, and the poor really does not have a good lobbying group. And states have to run balanced budgets. So if you have a company that's dependent on Medicaid, I can promise you will not get year-to-year increases, and you will often not get paid on time. And then once every 5 or 6 years, they'll decide to cut your payment 10 or 15%. So it's not a good business. The current environment, we believe corporate buyers are back. Private equity investors are being very aggressive. They're getting, I believe, lulled into a false sense of security by the very high multiples in the market right now. Valuations in most sectors are above historical norms. Leverage levels in the past year have increased by almost a full turn of EBITDA, where we used to get 3.5 times debt to cash flow or debt to EBITDA. We're now getting 4.5, 5, sometimes 5.5 times. Unfortunately, that's been passed on to the seller. That's why we're net sellers today. We're not net buyers. So what do we do in times like this? We focus on smaller proprietary transactions. We're not out buying asset providers right now. We are aggregating a number of companies that provide services to healthcare providers in an effort to make them more efficient.
That's a great introduction to the topic. And just one follow-up question to that. You talked earlier about the fact that you will do anything from a startup to a very, very large operating business. Can you talk a little bit about what the importance of scale in this business? That is, when you talk about a startup, what do you mean as opposed to, let's say, a smaller venture capital fund that might be throwing a few $1 million at let's say a startup psych center builder?
Sure.
What are the risks there, or what does scale really mean in this business?
I'll give you a good example. Right now, we are funding. For years, we have seen businesses that are wonderful businesses that provide a product or a service to a not-for-profit acute care hospital to make them more efficient.
Right.
But those are products. They're not companies, and they can get to $25 or $30 million of revenue quite profitably. And what our view was is if we can put a number of those companies together and call it a CFO's toolbox, then we can cross-sell those companies. And what we're doing right now is we're taking a gentleman who, this will be his third time with Welsh Carson, and we're putting $100 million behind him. And we're starting with a very unique, very profitable company in Dallas, and we will build a toolbox.
Yeah.
And over time, we hope to have $200 million invested in it.
And what's the size of the market for that?
I couldn't even tell you.
Okay.
Whatever a hospital buys, we can supply.
Good.
But you're starting with profitability, because actually
We're starting with profitability.
Because I actually want to then jump into my stuff, and I want to take everything that Paul just said and have you forget it. It's interesting. We're all on the life science, or we're all on the healthcare side, but our strategy, which is early stage, I mean, all the metrics that he's just on for his firm is quite different from ours. So we do early stage, both life science and IT. It really is the earliest stage, and when we talk about early, we mean early. Really, at the university level, we're talking about taking science out where everything, nothing is there except for the technology and the technical founder. And so it's a very, very different model. And what's striking to me about being on the panel, and delighted with Paul's presentation, and Welsh Carson is a wonderful firm, that we could be investing in the same space but have very, almost completely different models. And so I just want to set the clock back again. But how have we done? I won't get into the details of Polaris. We're a $2 billion effort. About two-thirds of what we do is in the IT space, one-third is in the life science space, so we're still a diversified fund. And over the 8 years since we created Polaris, we've invested in 38 companies in the life science sector. I'm only going to talk about life science. To date, they've generated about a 33% annual rate of return. Within that, 19 of those companies were my own companies, and as a group, they generated a 47% rate of return over this 8-year period. And then we had this very rarefied group called the Langer portfolio, and we're going to get into that more a little later, which is of 8 companies that have generated to date a 55% rate of return. So, and by the way, again, it's fascinating to listen to Paul because one of the challenges, and I'll get into this more, is you never hear the word EBIT or EBITDA with any of our companies. If you do, it has brackets around it. It's something that we have to be very, very aware of, and one of the challenges. Bob and I are going to make this interactive. We've been a team. I've had the enormous pleasure to be a partner with Bob for 10 years. He's clearly made a contribution to Polaris in our effort, and so we're going to try to make this somewhat interactive. And what I'm going to try to do is talk about the challenges and opportunities in the model that you use for getting a true early-stage life science company, technology company off the ground. And then I think Bob's going to talk about some specific examples of stuff we worked on together. What I want to stress is that this really is an early-stage marriage. It's a marriage of science and business, and sometimes it's a challenging one because Bob will talk about some of the stuff in his lab. There's some other wonderful labs around the country. When we get the academic paradigm is very, very different from the paradigm that we all live in. Academics are rewarded on a different scale, and so even at the moment of the inception of these companies, with the exception of guys like Bob, you're often talking about a whole system having to change, a paradigm having to change. Not just how do you do great science, but how do you convert that into products. And so that paradigm shift can often represent a challenge. Probably the biggest challenge, however, is that this is a very, very long path. From the time where a unique biological discovery is had at the bench, as an example, it can often be a decade before that product hits the market. And therefore, there's a decade of losses that have to be funded somehow, some way. Those losses can exceed $100 million, which is it's not unusual for a private company to raise as much as $100 million these days through its path. And by the way, you have to get a return on that. And almost always through that decade-long path, there are rights given away. No company can really do it by itself. It has to give away stuff along the way. And so putting together that model and figuring out the jigsaw puzzle which allows you to ultimately generate a positive return on that is really a challenge, one that takes time. But with that said, the opportunity is huge. Ours is probably the only industry where you can talk about billion-dollar products. A single product can generate more than $1 billion. And often can have up to 90% gross margins. So there is a promised land. And as Peter mentioned in his earlier, there's really not very much price negotiation when it comes to major cures. I mean, most people take the price because it's a huge innovation. And so there is a promised land, but now the question is how do you negotiate that path? I think to do the path right, you have to start with a big idea. And again, I think Bob's going to talk more about some of the big ideas that we've done. And that big idea has to have at least one of these two qualities. It has to be a brand new franchise. It has to meet some unmet medical need that's compelling. Or it has to threaten an existing franchise and threaten in a real way. It just can't be a Me Too product. It has to truly innovate an area where there's an existing $1 billion, $2 billion, $3 billion a market. And if you can come along and threaten that position, the market holder will look at you very seriously. So you have to have a big idea. The second thing is you have to have the right team. But I want to remind you again, when these companies are started, nothing is there except for the idea. And so we have to build these teams along the way. And again, contrasting it with the Walsh-Carson model, we don't, unfortunately, have the fortune of backing a pre-made team day one. Our job is, along the way, is to build an A-class team. And again, if you start with a big enough idea and wonderful academic founders, that's a good start. The third thing that's required along the way is syndication. We can't do it by ourselves. We really do look to work with other venture capitalists. Our current fund is a $900 million fund. Even with that, I might only put $20 million to work in a company through its life. I mean, and by the way, putting it to work in day one is a huge mistake. So we try to syndicate, and we work very hard at syndication. And one of the good things that's happened in our business is that there's been a new respect again for early-stage life science investing. And so there's been more capital that's flowed into that. Back in the 90s, actually, capital was flowing away from that. So syndication and syndicate partners are being better these days. And then the fourth thing that's required is corporate partnerships. And these are both good opportunities and bad opportunities. What you're really looking for is a fair deal in a corporate partnership. The challenge, though, is that, as I said earlier, is that at the beginning you only have the big idea, and that every time you bring on resources, whether they be a corporate partner or additional equity or management, those are dilutive events. And so managing those dilutive events are hugely important. And finally, the other challenge that's so striking in our business as opposed to the IT business is, in the IT business, you often have repeat entrepreneurs. They'll start a company, they'll run it for 3 or 4 or 5 years, they'll sell it, they'll make 50, 60% IRR, then they'll go start another company. It's very unusual in the life science space that you have a repeat entrepreneur, and that's because this path is so long. Most entrepreneurs that start their companies really stick. They have the commitment to bring these products onto the market, and so they'll stick with them for 15 years. And then they're really not up for another 15-year stint. They want to do something else. And so oftentimes when we're building teams, we can't rely on someone who's done it 3 or 4 times. Our success, I think, has been derived by 4 factors. One is we've been diversified. I mentioned up front that Polaris is both IT and life science. But even within the life science sector, about 40% of our investments are in the biotech space, 40% are in the medtech space, 20% are in others. And I argue that diversification allows you to do rational things during irrational times, and I'll point to some examples later. I think the other key to our success, and the best example that is sitting to my left, is just working with great partners. I think we've had the great pleasure of working with the Bob Langers of the world, and the Phil Sharps, and the Paul Schimmels, and the Kari Stephensons, and people that are truly transforming their spaces and are just great partners. We have been able to recruit great teams, and ultimately we can invest in great science, but the fundamental factor of success is recruiting great teams, and we've been able to do that. And then finally, I think we've paced ourselves. I mentioned that ours is a $900 million fund. We'll put $20 million to work through a life of an investment. But we're not afraid to put $500,000 to work day one. And in fact, Bob and I were on a board call yesterday where, with another group, we put $1 million into a seeded company. It's at its next level. We're talking about putting $2 million between the 2 groups. But along the way, I'll have the ability to put $15 or $20 million to work in that company. But if we pace ourselves, we can do great things. I think others in our sector have failed for a couple of reasons. One is many of them have over-concentrated. Steve talked earlier about the genomics, and during the genomics craze, there were 2 or 3 funds that got set up just to do genomics efforts. I think over-concentration is a really difficult task in our business. I think it also leads you to do irrational things during irrational times. When your whole sector is falling out of favor, it's very, very difficult to stand up and try to make new investments. Your psyche's just not there. You're working with all your problem children. And in fact, that may turn out to be the best time to be making those investments. I think many people in our space don't realize that this is a long path. It's a marathon, and they lose their nerve along the way. Now, it's difficult. In hindsight, it's always you can make the call whether it's losing your nerve or making good judgment to walk away from a deal. But I've seen too many people jump into the space and realize it's a long haul and then jump out. And so I think losing nerve is a real negative. I think people have overcommitted up front. There used to be a logic in our business which says the cheapest time to buy into a deal is at the beginning because that's at the pre-monies that are single digit. And if they have $10 million for a deal, they'll put $8 million to work day one because now they own 60% of a company. But by the way, with each subsequent financing, they're expected to play. They're expected to defend that 60% position. And if they don't, our world is very Darwinian. If you can't play, hand your shares back. We'll wipe you out. And that's the way our world works. And so I think people have lost sight of that. You have to pace yourself along the way. I think other groups have decided that they're going to back themselves, that they come up with an idea, they create a company around it, they start funding it. They really don't seek out the counsel of great guys like Langer to see whether this is good science and good medicine, and ultimately have disaster. And then finally, what plagued our industry was what I'll call jumping in, jumping out. Back in the mid-'90s, late '90s, many firms that were diversified became specialized in IT. And they abandoned our life science space. Now some of those have come back. And I think entrepreneurs and syndicate members question how long will they be back. And so they've lost some serious credibility in the marketplace. You don't want to be in a long-term race with a partner who may decide for strategic reasons to bail on you 2 or 3 years into the process. And so I think some of those groups have lost because of that. And then finally, I think they've lost opportunity. And I went back and I looked at the portfolio that we created in 1997 and 98. Of those companies we invested in 97, we generated a 91% rate of return. Those in 98 were a 78% rate of return. So during the darkest days, when everyone was saying get out of the space, and because of our diversification, we were able to do rational things during irrational times, and the results prove themselves. The core to our success, though, is partnership, and now I want to speak to Bob Langer. I met Bob back in 1993 at a company called Polymers for Medicine, which name has now changed. And what was striking about going into meeting Bob, and as you saw from the resume and you pick up very quickly, is the guy is brilliant. It's very clear that Bob knows a lot of things and is very creative. I came into that meeting knowing that he was world-renowned. Pretty much Bob can pick up the phone and enter almost any boardroom of any pharmaceutical company and have enormous credibility. He is prolific. If you ever had the pleasure of going up to see Bob's lab at MIT, he's not just doing one bit of science. He's doing tissue engineering, stem cell research, drug delivery research, biomaterials, biotechnology. It really is a panacea of great things. He's the guy of the highest integrity, which was very clear. But getting to know Bob through the process, I realized he had other attributes that were particularly special, which is that he was passionate about taking his science and turning it into products. He realized that many of the scientific discoveries that he was making was really going to transform people's lives. And so he had a passion for not just doing great academic research, which he does, but he had great passion for translating it into something real. With that, he was very realistic about the venture process. He understood that this was a marathon, that there were compromises that were going to be needed to make along the way, and that you had to be aware of those compromises. But the last attribute that I like about Bob, particularly once I'm his partner, is that Bob hates dilution. He hates being diluted. And once you're his partner, you also hate dilution. And what you work very, very hard at is finding ways to raise those resources that are required without giving away a lot of the company. So together we've invested in 8 companies. 2 of those companies are today public. 2 of those companies have been sold. If I look at that 4-company portfolio, they're generating an 84% IRR. 4 companies are in development. We'll hear a little bit more about some of those companies in a bit. So in summary, I would say that the don'ts in our business are to overcommit capital up front. As an investor, to become unpredictable. I think this is a marathon. You can't do that. To try to sell out early, I think, is a mistake. And to try to run this game as a sprint. The things that I think people do, and when they do it well, are to back big ideas, to continually be building these companies. Don't assume you have it from the get-go. Be prepared for the marathon. And then finally, to work with great partners. And the greatest partner that I've ever had is sitting to my left. So with that, let me pass it on to Bob.
Well, Terry, thank you very much. What I thought I'd start doing is telling you why I got into this, and then give you some examples of some of the things we're doing from a science and business standpoint. But after I got done with my PhD in 1974, I worked at a hospital, and then I became a professor at MIT. And as was said, I published a lot of papers, but one of the things that was frustrating to me was that we published the papers, and that's kind of all we did for a number of years. I thought we were making some pretty good findings, and I wanted to get those findings out there to help people. And just publishing papers, unfortunately, wasn't doing the job. And getting involved by first licensing things to companies, and then, but that was sort of the first step. But the problem is when you licensed them, sometimes large companies would take a license, but they'd do like one experiment a year, and that wasn't very gratifying. Some of the things didn't move nearly as quickly as I wanted them to. And so getting involved in starting companies actually became a great vehicle to do that. And so over the last, say, decade and a half, I've done that quite a bit, as Terry's mentioned, and largely with Terry. I thought I'd also say, what have I learned? I mean, and I guess I've, now sort of looking back, I think when I look at companies, whether it's things that we've done or other people have done, I've kind of found from a science standpoint that 4 elements actually are very helpful. Obviously, there's no way for me to quantify the people element. I mean, other than that you want great scientists, you want great business people. But from a science standpoint, I found these 4 things to be very helpful. One is having a paper, a scientific paper in what I'll call a seminal journal. And I'm not sure what it's like in the financial community, but in the scientific community, there's thousands of journals. But there's really just 2 or 3 that go through an unbelievably critical review. And those are mostly like Science, a journal called Science, a journal called Nature, and there's 1 or 2 others. But if you can go through this incredibly rigorous scientific review so that all the scientists think that it's actually very, very good science, that means a lot. That's the first element. The second element is translating that into a really good patent. a patent with what we call claims that make it very difficult for other people to sort of infringe on what you're doing. People use the term a blocking patent. The third element is actually taking what you found and moving it far enough so that I think an investor like Terry can feel that it's got some reasonable chance of success. And to me, that means probably getting a proof of principle in an animal. I'm sure all of you have seen that sometimes things are in people and they may not work. But, a lot of times you see good findings and they're done in test tubes. To me, that's still too low on the scale. You really want to have it in an animal model, maybe several animal models that show that it works. And the fourth one is actually a little bit more complex, and I'll actually tell this as a story. About 14 years ago, one of the vice presidents from a local biotech firm came to see me, and it turned out the company it was a public company. It wasn't doing that well, and he basically had been let go. And we were just talking, and I said to him, why do you think your company didn't do better? And he said, Bob, he said, we have 4 products in the clinic, which is very good for a biotech company, but he said, we have 4 different manufacturing processes to make each of them. And he said, this is just unbelievably expensive. He said, if we had just one manufacturing process to make those things, that would have tremendously lowered costs. And, of course, the medical area is extremely expensive. He said, that would have been great and make a huge difference. And so the fourth element to me is what I'll call kind of a platform technology, and I'll illustrate that with an example or two, a technology where you could use the same manufacturing process over and over again, but for different things. And that basically could give you multiple shots on goal. One of the things that happens in the medical area is it's unpredictable. You don't know whether you're going to succeed with your first product or not. But if you can take the investment in the manufacturing procedure that you've developed and everything else, the infrastructure, and apply it over and over again, and it's a good idea, I expect you will succeed. And when you do succeed, as Terry mentioned, some of these products are multi-billion-dollar products. So that would be the fourth element. So with that, let me just give you a couple of examples. So one area that we did a study in, and just to probably illustrate how things can come out of academics and how academics work. 1994, I had a guy come to my lab who wanted me to hire him as a postdoc, and his name was David Edwards. And he was largely a mathematician. He actually had never done an experiment before in his life. But he's a really nice guy, really smart guy, and I hired him as a postdoc in my lab. And actually the very first one of the things we work on is drug delivery systems. So the first paper he and I worked on, he handed me a paper with 300 equations in it describing how drugs could pass through the skin. And I always felt my big contribution was reducing that to 250 equations so that people could understand it a little better. And actually the paper even won a bunch of awards, not for communication, but at any rate, then I mentioned to him, there's this other area that I think we might be able to make an impact on, and that has to do with delivery of aerosols, delivery of things to the lung. He'd actually done some mathematics of the lung, too. And what I'd mentioned to him is, I'd noticed that there were a bunch of companies, large and small, that were trying to develop better inhaler devices. Say people have asthma and things like that. And people had begun to think, maybe you could even deliver drugs like insulin that way. Insulin's always injected. People were wondering, well, maybe you could inhale it and stuff like that. So what happened is all these companies started to develop fancier and fancier inhalers, better inhalers, and the field started to move. But the problem is the inhalers were actually quite large, and so and the reason is that aerosol delivery is incredibly inefficient, and you're lucky actually if you get 3% of the drug from the inhaler into your lung. The reason for that, as we looked at it, is that the drug particles that you inhale from an inhaler are incredibly small. They're 2 or 3 microns. It's kind of like wet sand. So what happens is you have like the sand in your inhaler, and it aggregates like wet sand does, sticks together in the inhaler, sticks together outside of the inhaler, sticks together in your mouth and in the lung. So by the time you get to where you want, you're lucky if you have 2 or 3%. So what some of these companies did is they developed better inhalers, to break apart the sand, so to speak. And maybe they got 4% or 5%, which is actually a big deal. I mean, it could almost make the inhaler half the size. But nobody ever looked at the aerosol particles. Could you ever redesign the aerosol particles themselves? You might think, how could you do that? But what David Edwards and I started talking about was Well, all these aerosols, people always thought, and this is often how science can be, people always thought that aerosols had to be very small, or otherwise they wouldn't have the right, let's say, aerodynamics to get into your lung. So if you made them bigger, for example, they'd stick in the back of your throat. But what we started wondering about was, what if we made these aerosol particles bigger, but we made them incredibly light, very, very light? From a math standpoint, if people always say, like, all aerosols or water, actually, has a density of 1 gram per cc. What we decided to do was make these aerosols with a density of 1/10 that. And to just give it into pictures, usually if you looked under a microscope and you looked at a regular aerosol that anybody would normally take, it would look like a little golf ball or a little baseball. What we decided to do was make big wiffle balls. It's a fundamental paradigm shift. So our idea was to make these aerosols big but incredibly light. And what we calculated was that if we made them big and incredibly light, they'd still have the right aerodynamics to get into the deep lung. But because they were big, they didn't stick together so much. Kind of like wet basketballs are not going to stick together like wet sand. So instead of a couple percent, we were actually able to get 60% or 70% in. We'd be able to make the aerosolizers factor of 10, maybe a factor of 40 times smaller. In addition, what else also happens in your body is whenever an aerosol goes into your lung, there's these cells, they're called macrophages, and they eat the aerosols. It's kind of like eating a small meal. They eat it quickly, so the aerosols don't last long, so you have to take it again. But now with these big aerosols, it took a lot longer to eat. It's kind of like eating a big meal. So we were actually able to make some of these aerosols last for several days with a single whiff. So that was the idea. That was our theory. But then we went ahead and did experiment after experiment, first in test tubes, then in animals, and proved that it worked. We published it in Science, one of those journals that I mentioned, got very, very broad patent coverage on it, talked to Terry about it, and we started a company. And Terry actually did the business development within, and pretty much every large pharmaceutical company wanted to use it. So actually Terry got big, multi-million $1 deals right away with Lilly, Glaxo, and Pfizer. We were in the clinic with 2 different drugs within a year, and actually within about 18 months, 4 different companies wanted to buy it, so Terry did all of the business, which was great. So he picked the one that he wanted to do the most, and we actually sold it. And I guess the IRR on that, Terry tells me, is about 500%. So that's kind of one example of how you could do that. Pick a second example, which is a bit more recent. And you mentioned Craig Ventnor before and genomics. And this example is very, very different. But so what's happened is that there's a couple of areas that I'm sure people have heard about. Genomics, which is DNA. That's one very important type of macromolecule. Proteomics, you've probably heard about. That's the second area, second important macromolecule. But there's a third, actually, that people really didn't study for nearly as much. And that's what we call glycomics, or sugars. So when you look at macromolecules in the human body, there's DNA, there's proteins, and then there's these polysaccharides. And unfortunately, or fortunately, depending how you look at it, as complex as DNA and proteins are, polysaccharides are a lot more complex. And the reason for that is that if you looked at a protein, let's just say, proteins are what we call monodisperse. If I gave you insulin, every single insulin molecule is exactly the same, has exactly the same molecular weight, every amino acid's the same, and so forth. That's also true for DNA. The polysaccharides, heparin, by the way, is an example of a polysaccharide that people often take. And not only do you have that for polysaccharides, but pretty much every protein, not every protein, but most proteins are what are called glycosylated. They have sugars on them too. So when you let me just take heparin for example. So heparin is not monodispersed. If you have heparin, even though we get it clinically, you probably get 100 different heparins. Different molecular weights are in that mixture, and they have also different degrees of what's called sulfation. So they're actually a lot more complicated to sequence than even DNA or proteins. But fortunately, at MIT, we've had some smart people, and who, fortunately for me, were my graduate students. And over a period of time, and this probably took us 20 years, we actually sequenced, we actually cloned a series of enzymes that could break up these polysaccharides. And we also worked out a whole set of techniques whereby we could, for the first time, sequence polysaccharides or glycoproteins. And this was also published in Science, and we also got a series of very good patents on it. And so one day I was talking with one of Terry's partners, and we started talking about this. And one of the things that we started thinking about is, whenever you take a polysaccharide or a glycoprotein, you're not just taking one thing, you're taking many things. So what if we'll take heparin, but what if whenever you take one of these molecules, you'd realize that out of this mixture of polysaccharides, some will have longer half-lives, some will be absorbed more rapidly, some will actually be targeted to certain cells better. And what we'd be able to do, because we had the sequencing technology, is we'd be able to find out which ones would do that. And from a regulatory standpoint, we'd have a much easier path because you're already taking those drugs. So basically, we know they're safe. So we'd be able to find, let's say, a superheparin or a superglycoprotein in a relatively straightforward manner by this kind of approach. So that's what we did. We formed another company, in this case called Momenta, we recruited a very good CEO, Alan Crane, picked as the first product a good heparin, got a major deal with Novartis. That company went public a couple weeks ago, and that, I guess, has an IRR for Polaris of 125%. So that's kind of a second example. And there's a whole mix. I mean, and I almost could trace our success or to a certain degree going back to those four principles. We've done better the more we've hit those four scientific principles that I've mentioned. I thought I'd just close by talking about a few of the things we're working on towards the future. One of them is this whole area of nanotechnology and what is also called microelectrical mechanical devices. Recently, what we've done is create a whole series of what are called microchips, and they have little nanowells in them. And you can literally, in a very small system, create a whole pharmacy on a chip. And so the type of thing we're doing is making incredibly smart systems where we could give people all the drugs they need someday, and even put little biosensors on these chips so you could detect, let's say somebody was diabetic, you could detect glucose, maybe tell the chip how much insulin to release, things like that. They're all in little nanowells, and so there's various versions of these. Some that could be remote controlled, like by telemetry. You could open up wells in these chips the same way you open up garage doors, for example, but you probably it's not something on your car. It's something in a wristwatch or in your pocket. And we're also working on ones that might be self-controlled, like with the biosensors in them. We're even working on ways that you can see medical record keeping is a problem, but now since it's a chip, whenever you take a drug, that information could be transmitted into a computer at your house, doctor's office, or hospital. So that might be one idea. Another idea that actually Terry alluded to that we're working on are things like stem cells, which you hear about a lot, and also this whole area of tissue engineering, which had many of its origins in our laboratory. And the point about this from a practical standpoint for patients is, we're always talking about drugs, and that's terrific, but there's so many diseases that drugs can't treat and probably will never treat. Like if you've ever known anybody with liver failure, there's no way I see a drug treating that. Right now, the only way to treat that is somebody gets a transplant. Paralysis, no way really to treat that. And diabetes, it's not clear, but there's so many what I'll call tissue problems or organ problems that it just seems hard for me to see that we'll be able to come up with single molecules that will treat them. But cells can do something that single molecules can't. And so that was the whole idea we wanted to advance in terms of tissue engineering. Maybe someday we'd be able to take cells and stem cells, for example, or other cells, and actually make a new tissue out of them, make a new liver, make a new spinal cord. And so this is not something that are going to be products right away. And I think really the key from a business standpoint, which Terry and I have been talking about, is figuring out the right targets, ones that are not going to be 40 years into the clinic, but ones that can solve some unmet needs reasonably quickly. But because of the vast potential of stem cells and tissue engineering can really solve some unmet needs and improve people's health in ways that really no other type of approach can. So that's pretty much what I wanted to go over today, and I'm sure all of us would be happy to try to answer any questions.
Just as a quick wrap up from my perspective, you talked about the time factor, how long it takes to get to market, how long it takes to get to commercialization. But we also talked a bit about, let me put it another way. we as investors can take advantage of the things you're doing by trying to get access to Polaris, I suppose, and others. But can you give some sense to the audience as to how else we might be able to participate as investors in the life sciences field in a quote, potentially successful way, or is it just too cloudy, given that you don't have clear earnings expectations, et cetera, for these companies to know where to invest and how to invest?
Do you mean
broadly in
as opposed to
any
investing
tricks
in certain
beyond
funds?
Investing at the?
You know, it's interesting, and again, Paul was talking about sort of the ebbs and flows of his industry. We certainly have ebbs and flows in ours, and I want to hark back to 98, 97, which is I think investors that have a long-term view. And by the way, it has to be an educated view, right? It just can't be, this is a good time, let's jump in. I think all these companies need capital along the way, and there are various levels of capital to be invested. So if someone, for example, today, I think there's not a lot of mezzanine capital around for these companies. I think, actually, we had this conversation earlier, there's actually not that much early-stage capital around these days. And I think if someone were to target and say, boy, I'm interested in investing in companies that were in the clinic, that were already demonstrating human efficacy of some kind, that were already in phase 2 and you had positive results, that probably is an unmet need right now. I think most people are much more interested in investing in phase 3 products that are much closer to being towards commercialization. And I think if I were to target an unmet need in an area where there's need for capital, it's sort of the phase 2 compounds. By the way, there's plenty of risk in phase 2, and people understand that you have to get paid for that risk. But I think that's sort of, right now, is the missing inventory of capital.
And I might just add to that, sort of to expand on a point I made earlier. I mean, for me as a scientist, one way I kind of distinguish it when, say, analysts talk to me is the company doing really good science? And I think that that's judgeable. In other words, if you see scientists publishing in really good places, like I mentioned, Science or Nature or other places, that to me means a lot. I know sometimes I have analysts call me up and they say, gee, we just heard this thing written up in the Boston Globe or BioWorld today that some company made an announcement. And I said, well, where was it published? And they said, oh, they just had a press release. So I usually take off points for that. But if on the other hand that they've published something in a really good scientific journal, that actually means a lot. I mean, and I think because and usually if you follow that back even to some of the most successful biotech companies like Genentech and Amgen, and you look at this, I mean, you can go back in time and really see that formula actually works quite well. I mean, whether it's for small startup companies or actually now large biotech companies that have been reasonably successful, they've done good science. And the ones that have failed, most of the time they've done bad science, if you really look at what's happened.
Well, on that basis, let's throw it up into questions and have a little more interactive session. Go to it, Mark.
Dr. Langer has done this to some degree, but I'd be interested if each one of you would choose a couple of segments, bottlenecks in the life sciences, healthcare delivery area, and talk about them in terms of what's firing your reading, what may be an investment area down the way.
Maybe I'll take a shot at that.
More specific.
Yes. I mean, so a lot of people are focusing time and attention on this decade. The path that it's so long, and people feel that if you can generate tools that can expedite going from preclinical to phase 1 to phase 2, phase 2 to phase 3, if you can abbreviate the path, that there's going to be huge value created. And there's no question that there would be huge value created. That's the good news. The bad news is that, as many of you know, because you invest in some of these companies, there's a consolidation going on in pharma. And so when you have fewer and fewer customers, in economic terms, we have an oligopsony. I mean, there's fewer buyers for it. And as a result, my biggest concern, and one of the reasons why we haven't ventured so far into that game, is that that you're not going to get paid for it. That, you cut a deal with Pfizer, and you cut a deal with Merck, and you cut a deal with Novartis, and then it gets a little bit squishy after that. So I think, though, so if you're looking for where there's value to be created, there's absolutely value to be created there. I think then the question is business model. How do you extract value from that? By the way, I think someone will come along and create a business model. I'm just very cautious on that. But if I were looking at an area, there's a lot of talk around that. There's also a lot of talk around post-genomics. What does that mean? I think that was discussed earlier. Clearly there was this push, the gold rush in the genomic space, or a lot of companies that were created in the genomic space. By the way, the genome in and of itself is just this, and proteome and other glycomics. I mean, this is just a door opening. We're going into a new millennia of biology. It's really enormously exciting, and we know that there will be real value being created there. I think there are some people that think that some of the post-genomics plays are interesting, that some of those companies that survive and still continue on with that path are interesting. They're at a relatively low value point. I think they had so much hype attached to them that they didn't ultimately deliver against the hype. By the way, they probably delivered against their original business plans, but they just didn't deliver against the hype. And some of those companies are reasonably well funded. So I think there's reason to study that. I couldn't even tell. I mean, I'm attached to some of those companies, but I won't point you to that. I mean, I would just sort of say if you wanted to study that, I think those are opportunities.
Do you want me to do it, or do you wish to? Well, I mentioned drug delivery as one model, and I think that that's an attractive model because a lot of these companies can get major deals with large pharmaceutical companies, and that's really an approach where you can take, like I say, this kind of single manufacturing process and apply it over and over again. And so you really do have multiple shots and goals, and I think classically a lot of those companies, I mean, Al's is an example. I mean, there's certainly been ups and downs, but have done quite well. And I think, again, with good science, I think a number of them will continue to do quite well. I think that's really the key. The ones that have good science will do well in an area like that.
In terms of the healthcare service area, two things are going to happen, I believe. Consumerism is going to become a bigger and bigger part of healthcare. There was an interesting article I read a bit ago that it was probably Biotech Today, so I'm not. I wasn't Nature or Science, but it spoke about for lower socioeconomic classes, we've given them wonderful access to care, and we've given them lots of funding for care. And that's the Medicaid programs. And we still see their health deteriorate. And what they've come to the conclusion was that those in the higher socioeconomic classes actually act as their own primary care gatekeeper. And those in the lower classes don't. And that's really what you have to give. You have to look and give people the tools so that they can manage their own diseases. And so anything to do with consumerism in healthcare is going to be a big thing. Additionally, the Medicare prescription drug benefit will change Medicare. I mean, what they've done consciously, and I know this because I hired the guy who wrote the program, or wrote the bill, was this donut effect in the prescription drug benefit. What they'll have happen is PPOs in the Medicare field will develop over a series of years, and they will offer a better benefit. And the skinny down benefit was done on purpose because they know that they're going to overfund PPOs and drive people through that. And that is going to allow companies or hospitals that have been living on rack rates suddenly to have to compete on price for the big part of their business. So companies that are either the dominant assets in a market are great investments, or companies that provide services to the marginal players to try to get them to be more efficient.
Question?
You mentioned that one of the key issues for early-stage investors is developing tactics to avoid dilution during subsequent funding. Would you elaborate on what some of those tactics are?
Yeah, sure. Yes, and they're hard, right? They're not obvious. I think probably the largest is this sort of interplay between IP and corporate partnering. That if you can, let's go back to the air example. I mean, the air example, the majority of the funding came from corporate partners. We actually ended up, it wasn't that large of an initial investment, and we found a way to continually find corporate partners who were interested in what we were doing. By the way, I want to go back to this opportunity versus threat. In the case of air, we threatened a lot of franchises. Pulmonary medicine. Pulmonary delivery represents $5 or $6 billion today. So anyone who had a pulmonary program had to look at us. But they looked at the concept, and then they looked at Langer, and they said, this is going to be really important in our space, so we better pay attention. And so we found a way to avoid dilution just by being able to, this now goes back to the big idea. The idea was big enough that we could give away small parts of the franchise in these corporate deals without giving away the entire franchise. And so as a result, we raised, again, I want to say probably for every dollar of equity, we probably raised $10 or $15 of corporate money at much higher prices. I mean, they paid 20 times what I paid in my investment, and because we had a big idea, we had elegant science. We had a hugely proprietary position. We had the world's best drug delivery guy on our board in the form of Bob Langer. They had to take us seriously. It was a threatening position, and they basically, again, it was, Bob gives me credit for doing the business development, but the business development sat there because, in the sense that they needed to deal with us, and so we found a way there. I think the companies, if I look at our portfolio, not every one of our companies succeed. I mean, ours is a high-risk business. I think some companies can succeed because the technology doesn't work, although that tends to show up early. That's actually an easier one to figure out. Some of the companies don't succeed because they can't find that magic, and they have to raise $90, $100, $120 million along the way. And then you have to wait till you get to the promised land of $1 billion drug, and then you've been diluted a lot along the way. So it's finding the principal sources through corporate partnering. And then there are other ways in which you can sometimes identify additional science or additional products that somehow collide with your thesis, and you can jumpstart the clinical program, you can sort of say. And again, I think if you look at Momenta and heparin, I think that's exactly what happened there. We had a thesis, but also they at the same time had developed this heparin product.
Yes, Juan.
You gave us two very eloquent examples of great successes. Could you give us examples of situations that didn't turn out so well?
Sure. I mean, in fact, that's why I was trying to pick the one that I started with. You mean ones that we were personally involved in, or ones that we've just watched? I mean, there's personally involved. Yeah. Well, I think.
Can't we do the others? Can't we?
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's okay.
Can't we be spectators?
Well, Terry has told me that all of the 8 have actually made money, but if I look at the ones that have made less money, the ones that have made less money, I mean, basically, are because we were just a long way from the clinic. So we had less in the way of animal studies. Just took us a longer time to get to the clinic, and because it took us a longer time to get to the clinic, to get that proof of principle, it was harder to get the deals, and and it was harder to solve the dilution problem. So really, when we were further away from being in the clinic, I mean, that's been that's made our life harder.
But let me give this isn't a Langer company, but we did have a company, and again, the name isn't important, where we jumped in. It was a major corporation had sponsored this thing, had put $90 million into this effort, and very compelling science. They, for their own strategic reasons, needed to abandon it. Nothing to do with the science. It was still very promising science. This company was in the clinic, had very promising phase 2 clinical data. We ran the phase 3 trial. All truth comes out of phase 3. And in fact, what we realized is that there was only a subpopulation of that community that we serviced. That the majority of the population wasn't going to benefit from this product. So in that case, I would argue that was a failure because it didn't meet our clinical endpoint. But again, the risk of this path is that you don't really know, particularly for therapeutics, you don't know whether you've hit the home run until you're done with phase 3. It's a long way. But that's a classic way to fail. The other way, again, to stress what Bob says, is in even a company where we've raised a lot of capital, I've not sold my shares, Bob hasn't sold his shares, that company could still hit the promised land. But it may mean that the path is 15 years to getting to the promised land. And from a returns perspective, to maintain the kind of returns that that we're so proud of, it's hard to do that with a 15-year investment.
Also tied to that, see, if you do new chemistry, which an awful lot of these things do that I've been involved in and that go on, that makes it take longer. Whereas, like, see, the air thing is new geometry. That's a much simpler thing from a regulatory standpoint. The Momenta thing, actually, we're picking drugs that were, like you say, are already in existence, basically. So so if you're able to come up with strategies that short-circuit or greatly facilitate the regulatory path, that's very helpful to you. And so in cases where we haven't done that, we've actually still got IRRs that are reasonable, according to Terry, but not as high as those two. And because we came up with those kind of strategies based on the science, we were able to really do extremely well. It all goes back, to me, like you say, to those 4 principles scientifically that I mentioned.
Douglas.
We all know that the basic building blocks of health are nutrients, vitamins, minerals, and so on.
first line of defense against disease is a strong immune system. And yet one hears relatively few exciting developments in either of those two areas. Are you aware of any or working on any?
Well, we actually do work on nutrients, so we do work on the immune system. But so the answer is yes, there's exciting developments. But whether they're the kind of thing that form a company in and of themselves is less clear. I mean, let me just be specific on nutrients and food area. I was actually involved. We actually did get involved once in helping get a company started in the nutrient area. But the problem was, it actually did make money also. But it spun out of another company that we started. But the difficulty was the culture in the food industry, in the nutrition area, is not to do good deals. You know, and it was what I'll call a high volume, low margin business. And so even though it made some money and did okay and actually had products, you know, I don't think it was what I'd call a spectacular success. You know, it's like a $30 to $50 million company, which is great, but not what I think the VCs and probably any of you look for. And the immune system's almost the opposite. The immune system, there definitely have been exciting findings, but they're so basic that it's been, I think, very difficult to translate them, again, as a single discovery, into something that would, A, make a good patent so that you could really protect it, and therefore franchise it to different large pharmaceutical companies. And also, it's so far away from the clinic, which goes to the point that we were talking about, that I don't think that people... it's hard for me to think of any successful company, which is maybe what you're saying, that's been started based on that. That doesn't mean that it won't happen someday, but those are, at least when I look at those two areas, those are some of the things that I think are difficult, at least in the area that we're talking about here. That doesn't mean there's not some great science that's going on and some great discoveries that are going on. There are.
One last question. Yes, sir.
It strikes me that a lot of what you've been discussing is the marriage of good business with good science. I'd be curious for each of you to suggest your best company in the listed market that marries those two. You know, best management, best science in the listed market.
I don't think you can do that. One of the issues that actually I don't know we may have, which is one of our companies recently went public. I'm not as familiar with.
You can't.
I can't. Yeah. So I'll say without saying that. You know, and I remain on the board of Decode Genetics. We talked about genomics. I think it's one of the post-genomics companies that is delivering what it said it's going to deliver. So I think it's well managed, and I think the science is very exciting. I think it's. I think for those on the scientific side of genomics, it's being recognized as sort of the world leader now in genomics, and it has, I think, a very compelling science platform and product platform. So I'm very excited about that company. Again, this other one we're sort of a little bit at a loss because the SEC would be all over us.
We can't hear you. Which of those companies?
Well, the one I never said, so you didn't miss it. So I was trying to.
I'm going to just take advantage to ask one more question. If you could be on the head of the board of HCFA or the FDA, how would you change the way you go about your business in order to improve the marriage of, or improve business generally, improve the commerce of delivering healthcare generally?
Well, if I was on the board of, if I ran HCFA, and I just hired the guy that did, I would, you have to put some element of quality and connect that with payment in healthcare. And until we do that, you will never have people making informed healthcare decisions.
It's like accountability for teachers?
Exactly.
Yeah, Bob will speak more informed on FDA than I will, but I would say that FDA has a very hard job, and I think for the most part we all benefit from the hard vigilance that the FDA maintains. They have to make sure that therapies and diagnostics come into the marketplace, that they fundamentally don't hurt people. And with that said, they're almost by definition the most risk-averse group in the world, because we all want them to be risk-averse. But if I were to suggest something for FDA is to figure out a risk management program, how do you expedite it? The other side is to say you can introduce a therapy that might hurt somebody, but what they ultimately forget is that by not letting a therapy enter the market for another 5 years, you may have killed thousands of people because you didn't allow the therapy to be entered. And to somehow come up with a better equation for how you manage risk, and by the way, and therefore to educate the populace to understand that the FDA is going to take some risks and it can't be penalized for allowing it to take some risks. It's just staggering how long it takes to get all the way through the clinic, and if there's a way for FDA to manage that. And again, I think more recent administrations have been very sensitive to that and have tried. But I think ultimately, you have the one person who screams, "Boy, I got hurt by this therapy," and next thing you know, they go back to the very risk-averse mode. But if there's a way to change that risk profile, it would make a huge difference.
On that note, thank you all for joining us today.
Nice to meet you too. Have you met before?
Excuse me. We're going to a few housekeeping items. Mark? Just wait for housekeeping. Excuse me. Rob mentioned the rigors of having a good journal in each discipline, and ours is not without its discipline. We don't have very many journals in our area of alternative investing, except for perhaps what we hear in this room. And I'd like to point out that our journal, which is the Greenwich Roundtable Quarterly, we're going into our 4th edition now. We're getting a very, very good reception at all levels of investors. I would like to just say, Jacqueline, would you raise your hand, please? Jacqueline is our editor-in-chief. But what we do, like, for example, Peter just asked some very good questions and mentioned HICVA. I'd like to ask for some volunteers of those of us who can help jury it. Is that what they do in academia? Is to sit on our board and help jury some of the articles that go in. So please email me or call me up or call Jacqueline or whoever if you'd like to participate in our publishing process. Secondly, go ahead, Jacqueline.
Also, if you didn't get the last edition, which has the Standard & Poor's brand on it, then give us your card. Make sure you're on the mailing list. This is inadvertent.
Everyone here is on the list.
That's what I'm saying. If they didn't.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jacqueline. It's through our Rolodex, people like Hunt and Ryan and Douglas, that we get such tremendous people up here. It's through our collective Rolodex and our wisdom. Peter, thank you very, very much. This is a tremendous panel. I will say also that right after this meeting, our programming committee will be meeting at the offices of Kenmar at 2 American Lane. Those report cards that you have on your table, this is your shot to tell us what you want to hear. So please write that down. And I'm really gratified with our underwriters. Our underwriters really dig deep and explore subjects. For example, we have a whole series now on private equity, venture capital, healthcare, information technology, thanks to FLAG. That's really been done very, very well. Others on the emerging markets through Ryan and Putnam Lavelle, and the same thing with Barclays. So at this point, Peter, we're very grateful. Would you like to say anything to the group?
I don't except to say thank you very much to 3 very, very busy people who have been kind enough to come down and visit us, or come over to visit us today. They've taken, this is a big investment of their time and to educate us. And again, thank you so much. It's a pleasure.
Thank you. Good job.